Welcome, everyone, to Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation. Thank you for joining us for a weekly research seminar. It's a pleasure to welcome today Dr. Robbie Shilliam, who's here to talk about his latest book, Decolonizing Politics. I highly recommend it. I've read through it. It is incredibly readable, very thought-provoking, and super interesting. So he is a professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University. He previously has been on the faculty of Queen Mary in the UK, the University of Wellington in New Zealand, and has his PhD from the University of Sheffield.
Sussex.
Sussex, I'm sorry.
It doesn't matter. It begins with S. It's,
The bio ran out right before I got to that part. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. And before I turn it over to Professor Shilliam to talk about his latest book, just a reminder of a couple of ground rules. We will have a Q&A period after Professor Shilliam's talk. If you want to get in on the conversation, one finger to get on the queue, two fingers to jump the queue and have a intervention on the matter immediately at hand. If you're online, please pose your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. And if you may recall, the rules are in the CSEC research seminar is that our pre and postdoctoral fellows get to ask the first one or two questions. So we'll call on them first. I'll try to weave in the online questions with the in-room questions as we're going along. Without much further ado, Robbie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Harold, if I may, for inviting me. Thank you, Kate, for organising. I really appreciate it. I've come with the sunshine. Yeah. So this book, Decolonizing Politics. So it's a book about how we can expose the colonial logics of political science. How we can rethink politics with different logics that don't depend upon categories that separate and segregate humanity into hierarchies of proper citizens, non-proper citizens, and degenerate populations. I wrote it for undergraduates. So I'm glad you said it was readable, because if it wasn't readable for you, it's not going to be readable for undergrads. So that was good. But just helped them to think more critically and precisely about current day controversies. There's a whole load of controversies about decolonizing the academy in Europe, South Africa, Australia. Here we get it in the kind of critical race theory, Florida books spanning all that kind of stuff. But they're all quite similar. For political science, these controversies pertain to the depth to which the foundational and institutional premises of the discipline are comprised of colonial logics. And for today, I want to get at the theme of the book. It's kind of organized in terms of chapters on political theory, political behavior, comparative politics, international relations. But I'm going to get at the theme of the book by talking about two theorists and putting them into conversation. And then I'd love us to extend the conversation. So let me tell you about the first one, a non-European political theorist. He was born into a settler colony which had increasingly become part of a broader imperial complex. His mother came from the colonizers who had settled the city of his birth. His father served as a physician to the elites of a competing imperial power to the north. The theorist I'm talking about probably spent some of his early childhood with his father in the court of this competing power. However, most of his life would be spent as an immigrant, as what we would call in the US context a permanent alien. As a young adult, he moved to a famous school in a famous multicultural city that lay at the center of his mother's imperium. Eventually, he founded his own school there. But despite always being associated with this multicultural city, he never felt at home there. He once confided to a friend that the same things are not proper for a foreigner as they are for a citizen. In fact, on a number of occasions, he was on the receiving end of xenophobia, and he was even cast as an enemy of the people due to his father's connections to the imperial power to the north that now threatened the supremacy of the city that he lived in. At one point, as this inter-imperial rivalry deepened, he was forced to flee as a political exile. He couldn't return to the place of his birth because that had just been destroyed in the course of inter-imperial rivalry. So he moved instead to foreign shores, married there, and raised a family. With the northern imperial power now hegemonic, its leaders invited him to follow his father's footsteps to live in its court and to be tutor to its elite children. He did so, teaching the subjects of monarchies and colonies. After some time, this theorist returned to the metropolitan city of the old imperium where he'd previously ran his school. There he wrote a treatise on politics that managed to survive 200 years of neglect so as to now sit in our libraries. Well, more inter and intra-imperial intrigues, twists and turns saw him having to flee once more under duress, this time for the last time. He returned to the city of his mother's birth, to her colonial states, and he died there. An immigrant, permanent alien, political exile, refugee, even twice over. Even if his mother had estates and his father worked in the court, that angle on the world made him theorize not only the citizen and the state, but also the slave, the foreigner, and the immigrant. All this to figure out who could pursue the good life and how it might be preserved from the degenerative effects of imperial expansion and war. So this guy was called Aristotle, and you've probably heard of him. Well, Aristotle was no revolutionary. He was conservative in the literal sense. Aristotle wanted to conserve the possibility of living in a just polis, but one that for him was modeled on the small settler colony of his birth, his mother's city of Stagiaira. All this had a bearing on the formulation of Aristotle's most famous statement in that treatise he wrote in Athens: a human is by nature a political animal. Aristotle's conception of nature is counterintuitive. It's what happens usually, and for the most part, neither accidental nor essential, stable enough to be studied, variable enough that any study will be imperfect. Unlike animals, says Aristotle, human beings are endowed with a capacity to reason that's especially congruent to the imperfect regularity of nature. To live socially, humans make choices to evaluate all the possibilities of a course of action. Such collective deliberation can help determine how best to attain the good life, not in an accidental or an essential fashion, but for a specific time or place. And that deliberation involves judgment, and this is the nature of politics. So what is the nature of politics in Aristotle's time and place? Well, he accepts that deliberation requires leisure time, and therein lies the rub. Those who plant a field, raise children, manufacture goods do not have spare time. Politics, therefore, can only work through a hierarchical division of labor, which enfranchises some as active citizens over and above other people in their household, such as women, workers, and slaves. This is the hierarchy that Aristotle wants to conserve, the only one that might, in his estimation, make the good life attainable. Yet recall his understanding of human nature. There's a subtle but important distinction between, on the one hand, arguing that hierarchy is usual, and on the other hand, claiming that certain peoples by necessity and essence occupy certain places in that hierarchy. Aristotle proposes the former. And remember the paths that he's traveled in his life by the time he writes the treatise on politics. He's moved from a citizen of Stagiaira, a colony citizen, to become a resident alien, a metic in Athens, to be viewed as a sympathizer of Macedonia. Because remember, I said his father served as a physician to the elites of a competing imperial power to the north. Well, that power was Macedonia. And it wasn't only the imperial power of Persia that threatened the Delian League of Greek city-states led by Athens. By the time Aristotle was born, Macedonia did too, and under Philip II, its armies expanded into Greek territories. Ultimately, Philip would conquer Athens and form a new federation of city-states, the League of Corinth, under Macedonian hegemony. So leaving Athens as a purported sympathizer of non-Greek barbarian empires, Aristotle sought asylum in present-day Turkey. After that, he tutored Philip's son, Alexander the Great, in the imperial Macedonian court on monarchies and colonies, and then he returned to his life as a resident alien in Athens again before one last political exile to Chalcis. All his life, this father of political science has moved into and through different hierarchies. And given this lived experience and his understanding of the nature of the political animal, it's reasonable to suppose that Aristotle is trying to sensitize Athenian citizens to the fact that their place at the apex of the political hierarchy might change. Empires, by and large, produce despots, and if Athens loses its sovereignty to these empires, then Athenian citizens might have to sacrifice their human faculty of deliberation to slavishly serve these despots. Might natural slavery be the fate even of the citizens of empire? Well, here's Derek Walcott, famous St. Lucian poet and Nobel Prize winner, comparing the Aegean and Caribbean seas and finding much in common. If we looked at them now, we would say that the ancient Greeks had Puerto Rican taste, right? Because the stones were painted brightly. They were not these bleached stones. Time went by and they sort of withered and weathered. The classics became something bleached out and rain-spotted, distant. And Aristotle, like most Greeks, considered Europe to be a land of barbarians, and Greeks were not Europeans. So let's remember this. The tradition of political science that the Western Academy says begins with Aristotle begins in a non-European world of empires, colonizers, migrants, refugees, and slaves. The normal citizen of the normal polis does not exist somehow outside of this context, but is entangled within it, within a violent imperial world. That's the context within which Aristotle theorizes the pursuit of the good life. But to return to his conservatism, even if Aristotle thinks that people's positions in the hierarchy can change, the hierarchy itself is non-negotiable for him. Citizens require slaves, wives, and other workers. Even if Aristotle is somewhat on the margins in Athens, a permanent alien, he's nonetheless convinced that citizenship is the best hope for the good life. Look, he's not talking to the slaves or to the wives or to the immigrants about the dangers of empire. He's talking to the citizens about preserving the hierarchy that puts them at the top. He's talking to the center of the polis. He's talking to the center about how to preserve the center. What about talking from those places that have been made peripheries to that center? What about talking there to other peripheralized peoples about those who have done the peripheralizing? Well, now we're going to put Aristotle in conversation with Gloria Anzaldua, a Chicana queer theorist. Chicanx describes, you know this, but I'm just doing it because like sometimes I do it in situations where people don't know. So anyway, I'm not treating you like an idiot, trust me. I don't know. So Chicanx describes those people living in the US who are of Mexican descent. Queer theory seeks to unsettle the binaries that are ascribed to people's personal and political identities and to raise the possibility that there are multiple, perhaps endless, articulations of masculinity, femininity, and other expressions of being together. Anzaldua confronts the phenomenon that in politics represents perhaps the most consequential division of all, the border. She tells the history of a specific border, that which divides the US and Mexico. Except the way in which she narrates this history is not from the centralized perspective of the state, of the polis and its citizen. It's a story of the borderlands. Anzaldua begins her story with the ancient ancestors of the Chicanx peoples who she says occupied or regularly migrated through the southwest of the US, an area originally known as Aztlan. In 1000 BC, these ancestors undertook one of a number of large migrations further to the south. In the 16th century, the Spanish conquistadors conquered these ancestors' lands of settlement in what was named New Spain and present-day Mexico. Germs arrived with the Spanish, for which the indigenous people had little immunity. The population collapsed. Mestizos, usually the progeny of Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers, had both Spanish immunity and indigenous heritage. They increasingly populated these colonized lands. Some of these mestizo, Anzaldua narrates, migrated back north to Aztlan lands alongside Spanish people in search of gold. They became the people now called Chicanx. Part of these lands were called Texas, which then became part of the state of Mexico after its independence from Spain in 1821. White settlers from the US migrated illegally into Texas and challenged Mexico's sovereignty. In 1846, the US took Texas from Mexico through a war fought in good part over preserving slavery's westward expansion. Much of the land lived on by Mexicans was subsequently stolen by white settlers. A race war in 1915 led to further violent dispossession. Many Chicanx became sharecroppers, people who farm on another person's land. Now, Anzaldua's point in making this narrative is that the indigeneity of Chicanx people is neither fixed nor essential, but constituted through mixing and movement. We have a tradition, she notes, of long walks. The colonial response to this tradition of migration has been one of violent and racist dispossession of lands. Home for Chicanx then is, she says, a thin edge of barbed wire. Conventionally, the border is the limit of governmental authority, marking citizens off from non-citizens and legal residents off from non-legal residents. The border is the frontier of the good life. Aristotle then shares something with Anzaldua's story of Chicanx people. His experience as a non-citizen in Athens, even as an asylum seeker in present-day Turkey, enables him to proffer a critique of imperialism. Nonetheless, his critique is designed to preserve citizenship. Anzaldua is not interested in holding the center together, even from the margins. She wants to get rid of the very project of building and defending centers, a project that seems to have marginalization as its quintessential logic. So Anzaldua conceives of the border less as a limit and more as a place that cultivates a particular kind of living. At the border, she says, the lifeblood of two worlds merged to form a border culture. This culture is the product of those who are not supposed to be able to create anything of value. The supposedly abnormal, non-citizen, maladjusted, and uncivilized that are so important to our foundational logics of political science. Anzaldua describes them as the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed. And the culture they create, she notes, is far from fixed, but rather in a constant state of transition. For Anzaldua, then, the border is both a place, a condition of being, and a psychic space. It's also a place, a space, a psyche that is brought into being by oppression and violence, especially when it comes to indigenous women. And that's really important for Anzaldua because for her, there is no culture, colonial, pre-colonial, post-colonial, that can claim innocence from oppression and violence. Anzaldua reflects on her own childhood. She talks of the way in which culture is made by those in power, the men. Women are only supposed to transmit culture, not create it. And that's consonant with the Catholic Church's insistence of the subordination of women to men. Organized religion codes women as carnal, animal, closer to the undivine. She must be protected above all from the shadow beast in herself. Man is coded as closer to the divine and the protector of women. Deviance is a crime against God and man. With these cultural strictures, there exist four options for women, says Anzaldua. Remain a virgin until marriage, thereby becoming a good mother. Take to the streets as a prostitute and be damned. Escape to the church and become a nun. Or use education to forge a career and become autonomous. And this last choice might seem most attractive, but in practice, Anzaldua says it's a choice available only for a tiny minority. Anzaldua then provides three responses to these unattractive choices. Firstly, Chicana women can conform to the values of culture, even if they are oppressive, in order to avoid rejection. This, though, pushes the oppressive nature of culture into the shadows, waiting to return. Or secondly, Shikana women might stare directly at what Anzaldua calls the shadow beast, at the sexual lust and the lust for power and destruction that underpins the male heterosexual order. But Anzaldua describes how she herself has followed a third response. As a child, she's rebellious. She hates constraints, even ones that are self-imposed. She talks of and embraces the fact that she has the shadow beast in her. Choosing to be queer, a so-called deviant, DeSantis, just close your ears. She realizes that the beast is not what it is said to be. The duality that limits human nature to either male or female, divine or beast, is fundamentally challenged by queer people. Anzaldua talks of herself as two in one body, both male and female, the coming together of opposite qualities within. For the lesbian of color, she says the ultimate rebellion that she can make against her native culture is through her sexual behavior. That is Ron calling me. But counterintuitively, and listen to this bit, she understands that rebellion to be a reclamation, a reclaiming of her culture, of its non-dualistic, mixed and migratory histories. Well, counterintuition requires counter stories. Anzaldua argues that her Shikana identity is grounded in the Indian women's history of resistance. She narrates a complex history of Quetzalcoatl, a name given to the creator goddess of Mesoamerican fertility rites and the mother of celestial deities. As a creator, Quetzalcoatl has both dark and light aspects that work in relation to each other, and her creative power is also necessarily sexual and coiled. Anzaldua recalls how this goddess was displaced by a male-dominated Azteca Mexica culture, and in this displacement, the goddess became less of a being, her fullness attenuated, cut in half. Then the Catholic Church forbade all indigenous spiritual agents on account of them being associated with the devil. But the church associated Quetzalcoatl with the Virgin of Guadalupe, the form that the Virgin Mary took in Mexico when it appeared to peasants in the 16th century. In these ways, the creator goddess was split from her dark and sexual energies and de-indigenized to become the good mother. Still, Anzaldua notes that the Virgin of Guadalupe retains some of Quetzalcoatl's subversive aspects. To poor people, the Virgin of Guadalupe represents the pain of conquest and oppression, but also the hope and the faith that comes with survival. Guadalupe also speaks to multiple races, religions, languages, and she mediates between Spanish, Indian, and African cultures. Through the intercession of Guadalupe, Anzaldua realizes that the shadow beast is what remains of Quetzalcoatl after she's been demonized and diminished by both Aztec patriarchy and the Catholic Church. Embracing the fullness of the beast, Anzaldua seeks to renew the powers of Quetzalcoatl, powers that do not reproduce dualisms of male and female, virtue and sexuality, reason and feeling, light and dark. This is why, choosing to be what she calls a lesbian of color, Anzaldua consistently proclaims throughout her book, "Not me sold out my people, but they me. Not me sold out my people, but they me." Aristotle was a critic of imperialism insofar as he feared that the diminution of the good life that it would bring, even upon those who practiced it. Still, this good life for Aristotle was predicated upon the hierarchies of the patriarchal household, including slavery. These are the hierarchies that Anzaldua wants to leave behind as much as imperialism. Reviving her Chicanx culture, Anzaldua promotes a new mestiza consciousness, a consciousness of the borderlands. Cultivated through the experience of oppression and violence, this consciousness does not seek out revenge, but rather wants to uproot dualistic thinking in order to bring an end to rape, violence, and war. It's born of a feminist struggle that requires new masculinities. Mestiza consciousness seeks to rupture oppressive traditions, re-narrate histories, and reinterpret symbols. It wants to strengthen tolerance and ambiguity. It blends all blood so as to help bring into being a broader communal ground for all those who have experienced violent oppression. It even hopes, says Anzaldua, that whites will stop trying to help us and realize that they need to follow our lead. Might those of us who wish to decolonize political science also follow that lead? Well, in introducing these two thinkers, I've also introduced you to some of the key maneuvers that I think are needed to decolonize the study of politics, the field of political science. And I should say, I do not think that absolutely all politics in the world have a colonial heritage or logic. They don't, and it's stupid to think that. But I do maintain that political science is formed as a discipline from imperial heritages and with abiding colonial logic. So I'm talking about decolonizing the academic study of politics, not politics per se. That said, I'm hoping you might have sensed that in order to pursue such a decolonization of knowledge necessarily requires us to commit to broader programs of global justice outside of the academy, at least narrowly conceived. Anyway, here are three maneuvers that I think are crucial to decolonizing political science. Firstly, recontextualization. We have to recontextualize political thinkers within the imperial and colonial contexts that form the backdrop to their ruminations. For instance, Aristotle is writing from within an imperial epoch where not one but two imperial powers are encroaching upon Athens, another imperial power. What's more, settler colonialism, or the expansion of the apoikia, has created the very polities that makes for his ideal polis. Many textbooks present Aristotle as the philosopher of the good life, the examiner of the citizen in the polis, but that vision would only reveal to you half the story. Aristotle examines the polis in relation to empire and the way in which the position of the citizen itself is threatened by imperialism. So we're now starting to talk about the second maneuver, the act of recontextualizing thinkers by reference to imperialism and colonialism must make a difference to how we understand the logic of these thinkers' arguments. Recontextualization has to lead to reconceptualization. For example, instead of just presenting the citizen in and of himself, we have to understand citizenship by figuring out, as Aristotle actually did, the relationship of the citizen to the metic, the permanent alien, to the wife, the slave, and the barbarian. The citizen can no longer be considered a standalone category. This means that reconceptualization is also an issue of epistemology, what counts as valid knowledge. Reconceptualizing involves tracking the connective tissue that arranges concepts and categories in a logical fashion. For instance, Aristotle's hierarchies are not comprised of fixed objects in fixed positions. Instead, hierarchies are comprised of positions that can be occupied differently by different objects. And the stakes at play in this reconceptualization must always be clarified by reference to empire and colonialism. For instance, Aristotle is trying to warn Athenian citizens that imperialism might force upon them a different position, a position of natural slaves. So decolonizing politics can't just be about retrieving histories of empire and colonialism. It's got to be about finding concealed or ignored logics in popular and conventional arguments. It must be about uncovering the deep colonial logics that animate concepts and categories in political science. And that's an empirical question, by the way. I'm putting that on the table as something that we've never done as a field and that we would surely want to do just to see where we end up. But that moves us to the third and the most difficult maneuver, which is reimagining. All disciplines of canons, and political science is no exception. The so-called father of political science, Aristotle, often sits at the head of the canon. But canons necessarily limit our understandings and imaginations. A critical evaluation of works within the canon is necessary, but not sufficient for the decolonizing mission. We have to also try to glean the margins of power. We must imagine, at least in principle, just in principle, that those who dwell in these marginalized positions have traditions of thought that are generally edifying. Let me ask you this. Why would we not imagine this to be the case? Just in principle. Anzaldua's notion of a borderland consciousness is developed in the borderlands to address peoples living on the borderlands, but to think about the world at large. It's not a provincial consciousness. Or let me put it this way, a center consciousness might be far more provincial in outlook. But if imperial centers talk to colonial margins, they rarely listen back. And that's broadly the case in academia as well as politics proper. And because centers rarely listen back, you'll not usually find colonial voices articulating themselves in the repositories and the archives of politics. That is the mainstream recorded history of politics and political science. So you have to creatively seek out resonances, perhaps in unlikely places, and bring together the responses that you can find. Is that a flight of fancy? Perhaps. But remember, Aristotle thought that Europeans were barbarians, their arrangements ill-suited to collectively deliberate on the good life. He might have considered the claim that you can read forward a European tradition of political thought from ancient Greece as similarly a flight of fancy, but it never stopped us. With this third maneuver of reimagining, we don't merely illustrate the ways in which some of the key arguments in political science have evolved with colonial logics and meanings. We also move those arguments into marginal locations or locations that have been marginalized intellectually, conceptually, and or materially. We could even imagine that these marginal locations connect to each other despite the wishes of the imperial center. Well, I demonstrated that Aristotle was profoundly small c conservative. Aristotle wanted to conserve the practice of citizenship, but this practice depended upon hierarchies of dependency, wherein the labor of slaves and women allowed free time for the man to exercise his deliberative reason in the absence of immigrants, in the agora, the public space of citizens, and the debating arena of politics. It would not occur to Aristotle to talk to slaves about preserving citizenship, or wives, or even non-citizens, even if he was a non-citizen himself, at least in Athens. But did no migrant ever talk to another migrant about the border? Did no wife ever talk to another wife about the weight of patriarchy? Did no slave ever talk to another slave about freedom? Might not non-citizens of various types conceptualize citizenship differently together? Well, thinking in such an audacious manner, Anzaldua's manner, allows us to place scholarly debates within broader constellations of logic and meaning. We gain a fuller understanding of the same issues. The master presumed he never had to know what the slave was thinking. After all, everyone told him that slaves couldn't think. But in order to survive creatively, the slave had to know what she thought and how the master thought. So who would you turn to for an explanation of slavery, him or her? Put another way, studying only the center probably doesn't reveal to you the margins, but studying from the margins can inform you of the margins, the center, and their relationality. That's the larger constellation of political activity. So here's the thing, we can recontextualize and reconceptualize the intellectual roots of political science, but without doing the work of reimagining, it's all too easy to recenter the center, even with the best of intentions. Most of the time, problems only become real problems when they hit the center, even if they dwelt on and grown in and circulated around the borderlands for generations. Sensational news items, shootouts, dirty deals, riots, wars, usually represent the visible tip of political phenomena that grow behind doors, in backyards, down dirt tracks. I'm talking, for example, about the murder of intimate partners, the slow death suffered by poor people living in toxic environments, the experimentation in techniques of violence upon those who have no course to legal redress. So ultimately, I guess I'd say that decolonizing politics is a serious endeavor. It's a serious intellectual pursuit in service of deeper knowledge and more adequate understandings, and the world is in a serious state right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robbie. We have about 25 minutes now for Q&A, and I'll go ahead and keep a queue. Go ahead and you can raise your hands if you want to get on the list. And I will also weave in some of the questions online. Please ask your questions online via the Q&A function. Ian, Trond. Okay, we'll start there. Ian, then Trond in the back. And just if you can please identify yourself and your affiliation when you ask a question, just for our online audience.
Yeah. Hey, Robbie, nice to see you again.
Hey.
I'm Ian Reynolds. I'm a predoctoral fellow here at Stanford CSAC and also the Institute for Human-Centered AI. And great talk today, great talk. I was just wondering how, in terms of teaching undergraduate students, you approach this so-called canon, right? I think we got a little insight into it today, but how do you contextualize a work that, the classics of realism or whatever? What kind of broader stories do you embed those in? It'd be really interesting to hear how you think about that. Thank you.
Thanks. We collect.
We just do one by one.
Oh, one by one. Okay.
We'll collect at the end.
Okay. All right. Yeah, and stop. I talk, so stop me. Right. Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things. I think we teach graduate students differently to undergrads. In other words, graduate students, we have to teach the field and induct people into the field. Undergrads, I don't think we need to induct people into the field. I think we want to teach them how to think more acutely about politics, right? And that's not quite the same as inducting someone into the field, right? So I think that's something quite important to begin with, right? Say we're inducting people into a field. So then what we want to think about, I would say, is the field in a capacious manner, meaning someone can be you can have someone like Hans Morgenthau or John Hertz, right, as a central figure in IR, and you got to read them guys, right? Or you can have other people who were just as important but slipped out of the field, or they were never re-narrated as part of the field. People like Ali Mazrui, who's a big dude on international organization, decolonization in the 60s, published in international organization. He's never considered a part of the IR field, even though we're having very similar conversations today, especially if you think about African Union and votes on the African continent about Ukraine war. I mean, it's not the same as the 60s, but it's resonant, right? So even if we just take the field, right? I mean, we can do the interdisciplinary stuff. We can do the weaving in people who weren't academics. And we can, so that's a larger conversation, but just bracket that and just be very, very straight-laced for a minute. So there are people who are writing in IO who are not considered part of IR. So we'd have to question, when is it that they dropped out? And how recent and how revisionist is our understanding of the field? And I would suggest it's incredibly revisionist and incredibly recent. And I would say that probably it's from the 80s. And that we have a very peculiar understanding of I do IR, which actually is created in the 80s and doesn't actually speak before that, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that even part of this is people like Morgenthau and Hertz. We teach and pass on a very attenuated vision and perspectives of what they were actually doing. So Morgenthau writes a book called The Purpose of American Politics. It's the first book he writes, which he seeks to Americanize his German realism. Right, he does one before in the early 50s, but Purpose of American Politics, he basically uses Frederick Jackson Turner, and he basically just riffs on, it's kind of quite plagiaristic to be honest, but anyway, he just riffs on the frontier. However, the whole purpose of that book is to say, I'm exaggerating, the bookend, the way that he frames the argument is to say that Brown versus Board of Education is an absolutely massive moment in the Cold War. because it's the moment which determines whether newly independent colonies, newly independent societies are going to track towards the US, or whether they're going to track towards the USSR when they see how racist the US is. Therefore, he says, the black freedom struggle in the US is a fundamental determinant of international politics and international security. 2020, George Floyd, everybody in international security is like, shit, what are we going to do now? So, do you get what I'm saying? But what do we know of Morgenthau except that, you know, the 50th version of his Politics Among Nations, which isn't even the same as the first version. So so I'm given a very constrained answer simply because we can go away and think about, you know, the good life. Okay, so it's not just Aristotle who thinks about the good life. Most of the most prescient understandings of the good life are developed in traditions of thought from those people who do not get the good life, like us with the good life here. So we can do all that, and I do that, but I'm just giving okay, let's just put that off the table. Let's just be very disciplinary. We don't actually even know our own discipline. So I think that's part of the way that we can do it, especially with grad students. It's a much more interesting field than we think it is. And then our political and intellectual reasons why, and institutional reasons why it's not that interesting.
And then Paul.
I'm Trondheim. I'm from CSAC, research scholar here. Very curious about your work, and had a question around the diaspora, because very often knowledge of the diaspora is, you know, sometimes more clear than people who are still left in the borderlands, as you call them, for lots of reasons. Mostly because information is widely available. Here at Stanford, for example, library would be bigger than any university, you know, in Africa or other regions. Yet there is a contrast and kind of a conflict there when the diaspora tries to, you know, decolonize discussion. So I was curious, you know, do you see a difference in this sort of argument when scholars are physically situated in westernized, well-equipped university settings, and I don't know what you consider yourself, versus, you know, scholars who never had that opportunity? And do you think that there are new strategies that need to be deployed compared to historically, which, you know, you'd bring scholars from other settings over, but is that the wrong strategy?
Yeah. Now, thanks for that. And that's a really important question. And we were just talking about it at lunch, actually, in a slightly non-diplomatic fashion. So I'm going to remix it and become diplomatic, right? So what's interesting about a lot of the furore in academia about whether it be critical race theory or decolonizing, whatever, is that it's usually led by more elite universities, right? And it's usually led by, not all, but tends to be more elite students, regardless of where they're coming from, international elite. And in fact, where the issues are most prevalent and direct is in the non-elite universities, right? That said, the intervention into universities of, for example, say Black studies, is a process which is predicated upon the ethical principle that if you're doing, for example, Black studies, you have to be intellectually and ethically accountable to the communities which you say you serve or represent, and at the same time to the academy, right? And that's something interesting there, and in terms of how we do our research, even our research design. I'm saying it's not a moral thing. It actually has an intellectual, it has an intellectual component insofar as the knowledge that you garner is going to be of a different kind to if you didn't have that ethical prescription, right? We nowadays call it engaged scholarship, engaged research. But you do different methodologies, different designs, which come up with different questions and different answers. If you broaden that out, it becomes an issue of political economy. And we then have to start thinking very seriously. And I'm glad you talked about the differences, about for example, the state of academia in the world at large now as it was, say, in the 60s. And in the 60s, and the Anglo post-colonial Africa, I know a little bit about. All these universities cropped up as colleges of the University of London from the late 40s onwards. It was all an era of upwardness in terms of, right, now we've got these colleges, now we're going to decolonize them. They were talking about this in Tanzania in the mid 60s, right? We're going to repurpose them towards, self-determination, and away from their kind of imperial hangovers and all that, right? Of course, now, every now and then, I had someone who called me up the other day and said, Robbie, we're doing they call me because I laugh and I'm a nice guy. So they just like, anyway, so they called me up, they said, Robbie, we're doing this conference on European studies, and we really want to make sure that we get some good representation, which is the right thing to do, right? Can you think of any African scholars on the African continent who do European studies? I'm like, hell fucking no. I mean, them universities, most of them, apart from Cape Town, and a couple have been hollowed out. Faculty there, to supplement their income, become research assistants to scholars in the West who are way junior than they are, and are just used as data gatherers, right? If you want to get any kind of career, you will probably have to leave the continent. No, but we don't want people in the US. We want, I'm being unkind, real Africans in real African universities. Like, good luck, man. You get what I mean? So there's a point where the representation gets separated from the political economy of it, and it just becomes fake and useless, right? So all of these issues, and it's interesting in South Africa, the roads must fall, linked to the fees must fall, and then the land redistribution thing slightly dropped out because fees must fall is, and I'm with fees must fall, but it was for the slightly more elite-oriented students, or those students who thought that they could get in. I would want to get in, to government. And then the link with that and roads and land dispossession falls away a bit. Yeah.
Let's go to Paul.
So Paul Edwards, Center for International Security and Cooperation. I'm a senior research scholar here. I don't really know quite where I want to go with this question, but I'm going to say a few words that might provoke you. So maybe that'll help. I wonder if you could take us forward from George Floyd. That moment here provoked a lot of soul searching, and a few scales fell from a few eyes, including mine. And then it ended up in the pit of DEI and the kind of very standardized institutional response that basically absorbs the shock of an event like that and doesn't really do much.
Yeah.
The thing that is sort of so obvious for me in a lot of the academy is the endless rehearsal of the same ideas and themes in the form of graduate dissertations. So I'm talking to you folks, fellows, and suggesting breakouts, but I mean, probably I should just stop there, but let me just say one more thing. So I work mainly on climate change and climate science, and the most well-known, I hope it's well-known, that the people who are suffering the worst effects of climate change are also those who are the least responsible, and they're those mainly in the tropical countries like India, equatorial Africa, any place where there is high heat, high humidity a lot of the time. We're going to see people dying in droves within the next few decades from wet bulb heat events. So people know this, but how would you think about that with the framework that you've been talking about?
I understand. And thank you for that, because it's a really important question. And to my mind, maybe we'll talk about this a bit more tomorrow, actually, but to my mind, it's where the theorizing stops and the strategizing begins. right? You're absolutely right about the George Floyd stuff, right? And in my department, a very, very well-meaning chair emailed some of us and said, should we do a statement? And our response was, no, we should not do a statement. What we should do is commit the department to a research theme on racial politics, which connects undergraduate teaching to graduate training to research to hiring. And our chair was incredibly good and committed to that. And now we've got a research theme, which of course doesn't give the headline. Do you know what I mean? But it is way more meaningful, I can tell you, right? But I come from a slightly idiosyncratic department, bit weird, and so it's okay, right? How would you scale that up? And what you end up with, and I don't say this in any moralizing way, I'm exactly the same. That whole kind of phrase that the discipline changes one funeral at a time, right? I'm not putting myself above that. The more you're in it, the more investments you get, the more you get known for certain things, the more you will never change what you're doing, right? I mean, that's just it's just institutional legacy, right? That's we have theories about that. All right. So don't treat these people as devils, right? That is a trap which everybody, ends up accumulating, right? I mean, we were talking at lunch. I think a lot of the post-colonial peeps, which I do and hang out with, are in the same trap. How do you get around that? One of the things I think we need to do is we need to operate in good faith and presume that many departments, the majority of the faculty, would be exactly how you are. Would be, I didn't train in this, but I understand that not only is it important in and of itself, but that it has a bearing on the more general and existential, questions that we're all invested in. I'm not going to be the one who's going to retrain. I'm not going to be the one who's going to, do something different. But I might be able to afford my graduate students something of that. And so what we're trying to do at the moment is build a lattice, a horizontal lattice for graduate students so that they can come and do summer schools, get embedded in a network which introduces them to methodologies, research designs, literatures, narratives, which will help them to think through this, but with their supervisors, right? Because what you don't want to do is just pluck someone out of their department, right? Give them something which no one in their department is going to understand. I mean, that's just a recipe. That's just unfair, and you're not even thinking about power. So what can they do? Which, if they were supposed to, if a dissertation looks and feels and reads a certain way in a certain department, and that it's not a dissertation unless it does something like that, how might one press that boundary just somewhat, by bringing in different material, such that the grad student still gets a PhD, right? But that process shifts the culture of the department slightly, and over time. So that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about at Hopkins, how to do, because it's easy to do it in departments or small kind of centers which are all funky and they can do that. But your question pertains to this question of scaling, and I think a lot of graduate students really want that. They might not want to do decolonizing or whatever, but they just have a sense that the nature of the problems in the world is vastly outweighed by the theories and the methods and the authors that they get given.
We have time for one more question.
Oh God, I'm sorry. You should have.
No. It's please. We have one right. It's a little forward, Kate. Right here.
Hi, my name is Ibi Lola. I'm a master's student here pursuing my degree in international policy. My question refers, I guess, back to the three crucial maneuvers that you mentioned. I wanted to know if there are any, I think about the decolonizing efforts in other fields, primarily anthropology, and how that's informed how you look at decolonizing politics.
Thanks very much. And as what I kind of mentioned in the book, but I mean, a number of people do this, is that comparative politics owes quite a lot to social anthropology. It's basically behavioralist method applied to social anthropology concepts. Right? And social anthropology cuts its teeth in the Pacific and then in Southern Africa. So there's a very strong connection, right? Here's my charitable take on anthropology, and then I've got another take. The charitable take is that anthropology was one of the first disciplines to do this kind of decolonizing. There is no doubt about it, and that it's been incredibly influential on all the other fields. I was going to say except for history, but no, because they do archival stuff too. It's been really influential, right? Now, here's the good bit and the dis bit, right? They had to. Why did they have to? Because these places went independent. You couldn't rock up anymore and just, go and sit in the field somewhere. People weren't going to let you do that. So they had to. I mean, it wasn't all the virtue or the, you know what I mean? They had to do it to save their discipline. So what did they start to do? Well, where can we have access to? Well, it's our own Western society. So what we'll do is we'll make our own institutions peculiar. The distinction between sociology and anthropology is sociology is, the modern society, individuals in society, that's the West. Anthropology is natives and culture, like the weird, right? Well, aren't our institutions weird? Yeah, they are. So we'll do that. One of the challenges with that is that it doesn't have to, but it can become a retreat, and it can become narcissistic, right? In other words, what it does is it actually stops or arrests that process of not only saying that this distinction in terms of how you study civilized and how you study traditional can't hold, but then how is it that we do something equitable and canvas everything rather than snap back? So the post-colonial lot did that as well. They became post-structuralists, and it was all about the quintessentially weird stuff about the modern self, and then every other culture was a mirror to better tease out the specificity and uniqueness of the modern individual, right? So that's my kind of, not diss, because not all anthropology is like that, but I think we can take it as a caution to say that we absolutely take a lot from anthropology, but it's not the model. Do you get what I mean? And in many ways, a lot of people would say that IR, as anthropology was to the early 20th century, IR is to the late 20th century. So we've got a lot of work to do ourselves. And, I was talking about Morgenthau, right? It's not just Morgenthau. What I'm saying, we can't substitute another field for our field. We have to be interdisciplinary. We have to interweave, but we have an ethical duty not to just evacuate our space as if it never has had any consequence. Does that make sense? I mean, yeah. Thanks.
All right. I think unfortunately we've run out of time. Please join me in thanking
Okay.
Professor Robbie Shilliam.
Oh, thank you.